Hello class, we're in our third week of being physically separated, but hopefully we'll get our process down of how we're going to actually stay connected during all this COVID-19 craziness. So here's another short video lesson. If this works well and we get the video conferencing set up, then my plan is to give you longer video lessons, and then we can spend most of the time in the video conference just communicating with each other and discussing the lesson and discussing what's going on. But today, what I wanted to do is to talk a little bit more about what we've been studying and how that's relevant to what's going on right now. So primarily we've been looking at the Olivet Discourse, the book of Daniel, and we'll finally get into the book of Revelation, because those are the three primary passages that tell us about the end, the end of the end times, and help us to get kind of a chronology of events, what sort of things will occur, and where this thing called the rapture might fit in. So we haven't made our way all the way through that. We're still in Daniel, but based on what's come up with the pandemic, just wanted to give you this brief little tutorial, kind of my thoughts on things. So from the Olivet Discourse, we saw that Jesus said that signs of the end would be wars and rumors of wars, but don't get too hung up on that. He said you'll see a lot of that, but then we'll get these birth pains of increasing intensity where there'll be world wars and famines and earthquakes. And he told us about lots of other signs, tribulation in Jesus' name. Many will fall away. There will be lawlessness. But, the good thing is that the gospel will be proclaimed to the whole world. Now, we haven't really spent much time in Revelation, but to really understand why some people might think that this pandemic that's going on is a sign of the end times, we need to at least take a quick look at Revelation. So I've pulled up this one chart that I had sent you before. When you finally get down to Revelation chapter 6, that's where these 7 seal judgments start. And the Lamb, Jesus, is the one who is worthy of opening them, and he starts opening them, and it starts out with the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. I'm sure you've heard that term before. Well, that comes from Revelation chapter 6, and those 4 horsemen, there's a white horse that represents conquest, a red horse that's war, black horse that's famine, and then this green horse, which represents death and Hades, but actually a little bit more. Now, there's nothing in Revelation that tells us when this is going to start. So, these 4 horsemen could be actually riding around right now, or it could be that this is something more intense for the future. That's kind of the type of thing that we'll discuss going forward. But a lot of people believe that these 4 horsemen are actually on the earth executing right now, and that's what we've been seeing ever since Jesus' time. So if we do look at Revelation chapter 6, it starts out here that the Lamb, Jesus, is breaking these 7 seals, and the horses are released. Now, I just want to talk about the last one, because that's the one that has as its name death and its companion the grave. And these 2 were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with the sword and famine and disease and wild animals. So we'll look a little bit at sword, wars, famine, disease, sickness. Not too much about wild animals, because I really couldn't find that much about it. I did see that there are a bunch of wild monkeys in Asia that are raiding some of the cities because the tourists aren't going out into the woods or into the forests and feeding them. But beyond that, I really didn't see much about wild animals killing anybody right now. So the first one would be wars. And you can see from this graphic on the left that the rate of battle deaths per 10,000 people since 1946, the end of World War II. Even since then, it's been decreasing pretty dramatically. Now this only goes through 2006. There's some other charts that I'll show you that actually go a little bit further, and it's been maintaining at this pretty low rate. However, if you look at it in terms of just number of conflicts, it's actually been going up. So I think, if you thought of this as being wars and rumors of wars, that's going up. It's increasing. But the actual number of people dying from war has been going down. Now we can take an even much longer view of this and look since 1500 out to 2015. Again, this time what we're looking at is we're taking 25-year periods. So this first data point would be from 1500 to 1525. Of those 25 years, what percentage of those actually included a war between the great powers of the day? This maybe gives us some sort of idea of world wars if the great powers of the day are involved. So, here around 1525, over 70% of those years involved wars between the great powers. And that maintained that very high rate all the way into the 1700s and then started decreasing. As we get into the modern era, then it's pretty low. And since 2000, it's been pretty much zero. Another way to look at this is global deaths in conflicts, and this time it's from 1400. And it shows in red the military plus civilian death rate, and in blue, which is only since the 1940s, just the military death rate. Now this rate of deaths is per 10,000 people. So it's normalized basically by the population. Now, two events that certainly in the United States we would think of would be World War I and World War II. And they're sitting right here and right here. And World War II, including genocides and things like that, it is the highest. But not too far behind is this period in here in the 1600s when there was the 30 Years' War. And that's actually even higher than World War I. So historically, there have been plenty of events and times when there have been a lot of people dying due to war. And you can see it repeats itself quite a bit. But at least recently, everything seems to be trending downward. Even though we're having more conflicts, fewer people are dying. Some of that's because of medical treatments for it. So we have a lot more soldiers who are surviving, but they're missing limbs. So they're dealing with other sorts of things rather than just dying on the battlefield. But we also, just don't have the big sort of, conflicts that historically the world has engaged in. So what about famines? We're hearing right now, the locusts that are over in Africa. Even with that, the number of people dying from famines in modern times, since the 70s, it is minuscule compared with what it was earlier. So here, 1870s, lots of people died of the Irish potato famine, which would have been in here. But just worldwide, the number of people who are starving to death has dramatically dropped in recent years. Now, volcanoes wasn't on the list, but I kind of threw it in with earthquakes because the two kind of go together. And natural disasters just kind of in general. So what you can see here is the number of volcanoes per year since 1800. And that certainly is trending upward if you look at all volcanoes. But if you look at eruptions that, have greater than a certain power, in other words, these are the ones that are really destructive, that's pretty much flat. So we're having more volcanoes, but most of them are not really causing a lot of damage. How about hurricanes? We hear so much about that. But you look at the long-term historical data, and this only goes through 1970. I've seen ones that go to 1900. Whether you're talking about all, all of them, or just ones category 1 or 2, or just the more intense 3, 4, 5s, the long-term averages really haven't changed that much, over this span of years. Earthquakes, same sort of thing here. If you look at just the magnitude 7+ earthquakes, the ones that are very intense, the U.S. Geological Survey reports that since 1900, the number of those has been stable. However, we do detect more earthquakes now because we have a lot more sensors out there, better sensors, and fracking has caused a lot of low-intensity earthquakes. What about sickness and disease? So this graphic shows since 165 all of the major disease outbreaks, although even it isn't completely inclusive. I would have included the polio, which is a more recent one that occurred in the 40s and 50s. But you can see the size of these fuzzy balls is based on the number of people that have died. This is not normalized by the population. So the bubonic plague back in the 1300s, in terms of the population, it was much more devastating than any of these other outbreaks. But you can see historically there have been many different plagues and outbreaks. The Spanish flu in the last century was probably the biggest one, followed by HIV, which occurred over a much longer period of time. And here we've got our novel coronavirus, COVID-19, which is ongoing. It's unlikely it could get anywhere near this, but that's because the entire world is reacting to it, and medical science has progressed so much since the early 1900s. Also, the Spanish flu was much more devastating across age ranges, so even healthy young adults were dying from it, whereas the coronavirus seems to mostly be affecting those with pre-existing conditions and those who are older. So what does this mean, just in general, all these different things? Well, let's look at life expectancy. In the 1800s, the average age of death was somewhere around 30 years. Didn't matter where you were. Jump all the way forward to 1950, and in most of the industrialized world, we're up in the 50s to 60s, still in the 30s in most of Africa, parts of Asia. And 2015, you're now approaching 80 in a lot of the world, still in the 50s and 60s in some parts of Africa. A lot of this has to do with the medical science, access to drugs, healthcare, things like that. But just in general, the world is much older than it was a century ago. So, people are saying, COVID-19, it's a sign of the end. As I've shown you, there's been plenty of famines, the bubonic plague, and I didn't even talk about the American Civil War. We had more people in the U.S. die from that war than any other. In fact, until recently, it was more than all other wars combined. And, what about in 1918? They had the Spanish flu going on, and simultaneously World War I. And then in the 1940s, simultaneously you had World War II going on and the polio epidemic. So the world has gone through much more trying events simultaneously than we are currently going through right now with COVID-19. Not saying COVID-19 isn't bad, but historically, this isn't the worst that the world has seen. But why do we have all of these events going on? Well, part of it's just because we live in a cursed world. But I think that C.S. Lewis kind of gives us a clue in his book, The Problem of Pain, because he gives us this quote here, which kind of tells us there's a benefit. Pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So I think one reason that God allows events like what's going on right now is he's using his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. This isn't just about life or death. This is also economically an event that is unprecedented, I think. And it's affecting everybody's lives. It's taken so much of what people have relied upon. A lot of their wealth has disappeared in a hurry, and their access to entertainment. All kinds of people are complaining. I can't watch my sports. I can't go to the movies. I can't go and party and do all of this. So God's taken away a lot of things that people took for granted and were putting all their trust and faith in. And I think he may be trying to rouse that deaf world. I just want to close by taking a look at Abraham Lincoln and his life and how he was roused by these sorts of painful events in his life. He was our president during the Civil War, the time when we lost more life than any other time in our history. And when Lincoln became president, he was not a Christian. He was not a member of a church. And he said, I am not a Christian. God knows I would be one, but I am not. And when asked about it, he said, when he went to Springfield, he fell in with agnostic and skeptical people who gave him this Volney's ruins. And those viciously attacked the Bible and had a chilling effect on his faith. And he was basically a skeptic. And it wasn't until February 20th of 1862, when his son died of typhoid fever, that pain struck and he started reconsidering. He was so overwhelmed with grief that he set aside every Thursday to mourn for his son's death. But Francis Vinton, a rector of Trinity Church, told him it was not right to mourn this way. He said, your son is alive in paradise with Christ, and you must not continue. But Lincoln exclaimed, alive? Alive? Surely, sir, you mock me. No, Mr. President, it is a great doctrine of the church. Jesus himself said that God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Lincoln leaped to his feet, threw his arms around this pastor. He wept openly and said, alive, alive, my boy is alive. And from that time, even his wife noticed a change in Lincoln. So this was February 20th of 1862. Civil War is already going on. In March 30th of 1863, Lincoln, at the behest of the Senate, proclaimed a national day of prayer and fasting. And I just want to read this to you. It says, whereas the Senate of the United States, devoutly recognizing the supreme authority and just government of Almighty God in all of the affairs of men and of nations, has, by a resolution, requested the President to designate and set apart a day for national prayer and humiliation. And whereas it is the duty of nations as well as men to own their dependence upon the overruling power of God, to confess their sins and transgressions in humble sorrow, yet with assured hope that genuine repentance will lead to mercy and pardon, and to recognize the sublime truth announced in the Holy Scriptures and proven by all history, that those nations only are blessed whose God is the Lord. And insomuch as we know that by his divine law, nations like individuals are subjected to punishments and chastisements in this world, may we not justly fear that the awful calamity of civil war, which now desolates the land, may be but a punishment inflicted upon us for our presumptuous sins, to the needful end of our national reformation as a whole people. We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers, wealth, and power, as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were pronounced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. It behooves us then to humble ourselves before the offended power, to confess our national sins, and to pray for clemency and forgiveness. I think we could say the exact thing about our country right now. But before I go to the next slide, which is the last one, just note this is March 30th of 1863. The Battle of Gettysburg occurred in July of 1863, and we all know about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, how he went there. After Gettysburg, long after, an Illinois clergyman asked Lincoln, "Do you love Jesus?" His reply was, "When I left Springfield," remember, as a skeptic, he asked people to pray for him. He was not a Christian. "When I buried my son, the severest trial of my life, I was not a Christian." So even after those events that we read previously, where there was a change in his life and he took hope in his son being alive, he said, "I was not a Christian. But when I went to Gettysburg and saw the graves of thousands of our soldiers, I then and there consecrated myself to Christ. Yes, I do love Jesus." This is even after that proclamation that we just read previously. People can have a knowledge of God, they can still hope in God, but not fully put their faith and trust in Him. And for Lincoln, that didn't occur until he saw all those troops lying dead on the battlefield. And that pain of that event is what finally got him to bend the knee and give his life to Christ. And how many people are like that today? So maybe God is using COVID-19, financial crisis, loss of entertainment, to use his megaphone to shout to this sick and dying world and call him back to himself. So I think we can do nothing better than what Lincoln asked the country to do in March of 1863, but to humble ourselves before the offended power, confess our national and personal sins, and pray for clemency and forgiveness. All right, guys, I will hopefully see and talk to you on Sunday. Thanks.